The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Channel School, a leading provider of quality educational resources that help teachers bring the world to their students.
This is TLC Elementary School, a place where teachers of kindergarten through 6th grade can find high-quality documentary programs chosen to inform and delight students. Use TLC Elementary School to complement your classroom lessons and to give students an up-close look at the world and the people around them. On this edition of TLC Elementary School, take a closer look at ancient Greece. First, learn how Alexander the Great became one of history's greatest conquerors. Then, explore the ideas of Greek philosophy and find out how Socrates and Plato changed our way of thinking. Finally, take a journey through Homer's Odyssey and meet the characters of this mythical world. And watch for classroom activities right after each segment. Segment 1. History. Alexander the Great.
On a brisk autumn morning in 331 BC, a small band of Greek warriors was preparing for battle. Their enemy, the Persian Empire, the most powerful nation on earth. The Greek army was tired, homesick, and outnumbered 5-1. But their 26-year-old leader, Alexander, wasn't about to let them give up. He was on a mission to conquer the world. Some would say Alexander was born for greatness. For starters, he was the son of a great king. His father, Philip II, ruled Macedonia, a kingdom north of Greece. In the 4th century BC, Philip conquered Greece and united Greece's independent city-states under one rule. King Philip wanted his son to rule an empire, but he knew a leader needed brains as well as brawn. So the king brought in the celebrated philosopher Aristotle from Athens to teach Alexander how to observe, reason, and think ahead. His lessons would make Alexander the first great strategist in military history. Greek mythology also played a crucial role in Alexander's education. Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, told the story of Achilles, a Greek warrior during the Trojan War. Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad with him for the rest of his life. Achilles, brave, fearless, and good, was his role model and hero. Alexander's chance to rule came sooner than he expected. He became king in 336 BC when he was just 21 years old, after his father was assassinated. As the new king, Alexander made a promise to all of Greece. If they would band together and provide him with soldiers, ships, and supplies, he would conquer Persia, their hated enemy. In 334 BC, with an army of 45,000 men, Alexander began his historic crusade. Once he crossed into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, he would never set foot in his homeland again. Darius III, Emperor of Persia, was waiting for Alexander in Anatolia with an army of 100,000 men. Alexander's army was outnumbered 2-1, but he had a plan. He organized his troops into a fighting formation called a phalanx. Tightly knit blocks of foot soldiers created a deadly wall of spikes with their lances. Trapped from behind by their own men, row after row of Persians were speared. Fearing defeat, Darius deserted his army and fled. At the age of 23, Alexander had driven the Persians out of the entire Mediterranean region, but he still wasn't satisfied. Alexander traveled 500 miles along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to Egypt. Egypt, a world power for 2,000 years, had fallen under the harsh rule of Persia. Because of this, the Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a savior. In 331 BC at Memphis, Egypt's capital, Alexander was proclaimed pharaoh. His empire now covered nearly 500,000 square miles. Eager to spread Greek learning and culture throughout the known world, Alexander built a great city in Egypt at the mouth of the Nile River. As in Greece, the streets were laid out on a grid. Theaters, stadiums, temples, and assembly halls were built as monuments to his homeland. He called it Alexandria. Over the next few years, he would build a dozen more like it throughout the Middle East. Each of them was a miniature Greece transplanted to foreign soil. Meanwhile, back in Persia, King Darius was desperate for a way to stop Alexander. This time, King Darius summoned all his troops, a vast imperial army of 300,000 men. And so the brisk autumn morning of 331 BC arrived. The two armies collided at a place called Gaugamela. When rumors spread of the size of the Persian army, panic swept through the Greek camp. This time, they were outnumbered 5 to 1. After 3 years and 2,000 miles, they thought Alexander had led them to certain death. On September 20th, 331 BC, Alexander's forces marched against the full might of the Persian Empire. The decisive confrontation was at hand. Darius relied on strength. Alexander relied on strategy. Alexander believed the weakness of the Persians was Darius's lack of courage. He ordered his troops to turn and charge straight at Darius. The Persian leader once again lost his nerve and fled. Abandoned by their king, the Persians could find no reason to continue fighting. The victory belonged to Alexander. By the age of 25, Alexander had defeated the largest and most powerful empire of its time and been proclaimed king of Macedonia, Greece, Palestine, Egypt, and Asia. But for Alexander, there were still lands to conquer. Pushing farther east, he went where no Greek had ever gone before, into Afghanistan and India. He built 10 cities throughout Persia, Afghanistan, Turkestan, and India. In each, he left generals from his army in charge, planting seeds of Greek civilization thousands of miles from Greece. From Athens to India, Alexander had become a hero of mythic proportions. Alexander, though, proved to be all too human. The man who had survived countless life-threatening battle wounds was finally struck down by a mosquito, which carried the disease malaria. Alexander died on June 10, 323 BC. After 13 years of fighting, he had conquered 2 million square miles and never lost a battle. Without him, his empire began to crumble, torn apart by the squabbling of rival generals and petty kings. But by spreading Greek culture throughout his empire, Alexander the Great left a legacy that still exists today in government, religion, art, and architecture.
Try this activity to complement history. Alexander the Great. Follow the leader. Create a map of ancient Greece showing Alexander's expansion through the Middle East. Then, compare your ancient map to a modern-day map. Segment 2, Philosophy, Socrates and Plato.
What is justice? What is the difference between right and wrong? What should we teach the young? These are hard questions, but they are questions the ancient Greeks thought all wise men should try to answer. The Greeks even invented a word that means lover of wisdom, philosophos, or philosopher. The pursuit of wisdom, sometimes called philosophy, is one of the lasting achievements of ancient Greek civilization.
Virtue?
One of the most important Greek philosophers was a man who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." His name was Socrates, and you could find him arguing with people on the sidewalks of Athens during the 5th century BC.
Ever since this skunk set up shop here, he's made me work twice as hard.
So you say Simmias here is your enemy because he makes you work harder than you did before?
Wasn't that enough to make any man your enemy?
But an enemy is a man who does you evil, isn't he?
Any fool knows that.
And a friend is one who does you good.
Any fool knows that, too.
But what a fool does not know is what is good and what is evil. Now, you make better vases and you work harder because of Simmias competition. Do you not, Pythagoras?
This question and answer method of teaching is still known today as the Socratic method.
By virtue do you mean...
To talk to Socrates was to be taken down the garden path, at the end of which one finds that, alas, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's fun to read the works. You sympathize with the person Socrates is questioning. And you have a sense that this poor person is being had, but you don't know exactly how it's being done. Socrates is the master of this.
Socrates made a lot of enemies because he questioned many of the ideas people believed in. The leaders of Athens soon grew tired of being tripped up by Socrates' sharp tongue. In 399 BC, the 69-year-old philosopher was brought to trial for corrupting the young. Socrates was offered his freedom if he would just stop questioning people. He refused. He was condemned to die by drinking poison made from the hemlock plant. But the teachings of Socrates would live on thanks to his most famous student, Plato. Plato made Socrates the main character in more than 20 of his books, including The Republic, a series of imaginary conversations between Socrates and others. Plato was born during the Golden Age of Athens, around 428 BC. The newly completed Parthenon towered over the city, one of the crowning achievements of the world's first democracy. The first plays were performed, and the first great histories written. But it was also a time of devastating human loss. For the first 23 years of Plato's life, the Peloponnesian War raged between Athens and its neighbor Sparta. Plato thought there must be a better way to live. In his book, The Republic, Plato describes a utopia, an imaginary perfect world in which everybody gets one job for life and is assigned a social rank. There is no war because philosophers, of course, are kings. To ensure that this perfect world remains perfect, children are only allowed to hear heroic and uplifting tales. The famous national epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are out because the gods behave badly and the heroes are flawed. How would you feel if your favorite movies and TV shows were banned because they were considered bad for you? Plato was serious about spreading his ideas. He even started a school called the Academy. The Academy's most famous student was a kid named Aristotle, who went on to tutor Alexander the Great. The writings of the Greek philosophers might have been lost forever after the Roman Empire collapsed, except for the work of Islamic scholars. They translated Plato into Arabic and passed his books through Egypt, India, Persia, and Spain. It wasn't until centuries later that the ancient texts finally reappeared in Europe. Philosophy, wrote Aristotle, begins in wonder. We still wonder about the same questions that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asked all those centuries ago. The quest for wisdom and justice is as important today as it was in ancient Greece.
Try this activity to complement philosophy, Socrates, and Plato. Socrates believed it was important to think deeply about life. Select a question that the class can explore together, such as, what makes something fair? Then hold a roundtable discussion about it. Segment 3, Mythology, Homer's Odyssey.
There once was a Greek warrior who wanted nothing more than to stop fighting and go home, to be with his wife, his son, and sleep in his own bed. Instead, the gods dealt a serious blow to his plans. Of course, the story of this warrior, named Odysseus, isn't true. It was made up by a Greek poet named Homer in the 9th century BC. But it's a story with a purpose, to explain a world filled with heroes, gods, and villains. The world of the ancient Greeks. The word mythology comes from the Greek word for storytelling. Before history and before science, myths were the stories people told to explain the world around them. The Odyssey is the most famous example of Greek mythology. It tells the story of Odysseus, who fought long and hard for Greece during the Trojan War. The Odyssey is about his attempt to return home to his wife Penelope and to the Greek island of Ithaca, where he is king. But his trip turns into a nightmare, a series of tests for the hero that puts him in one crisis after another. What should have been a 2-week trip from Troy to Ithaca ends up taking 10 years. It is these obstacles Odysseus must overcome that makes the book so exciting. It's a style of storytelling that still exists today. Think of action-adventure movie heroes like Indiana Jones. He's really just Odysseus with a hat. Trouble starts early for Odysseus and his crew when they land on the island of the Cyclops in search of food. Instead, they become food when this giant one-eyed monster eats some of the crew. Odysseus pays the Cyclops back with a sharp stick to the eye. He and the remaining crew escape, but as they're leaving, Odysseus can't resist bragging. He shouts, "The one who has blinded you! I am Odysseus, sacker of cities, king of Ithaca!" Big mistake. The Cyclops' father is Poseidon, god of the sea. Poseidon condemns Odysseus to wander the sea and face difficult tests. Odysseus is suddenly in for a long and dangerous trip. He lands on the island of the witch Circe, who turns his men into pigs. After a year, they finally escape, only to end up crossing the path of more dangerous women, the Sirens. The Sirens were a group of women who used their seductive songs to lure sailors to their deaths. Fortunately for Odysseus, he has been warned. He has himself tied to the ship's mast so he can resist their singing. Having escaped the sirens, Odysseus and his crew soon find themselves between a rock and a hard place. The deadly whirlpool Charybdis and the six-headed monster Scylla, who lives in a cave above the sea. Odysseus must make a choice. Which is the lesser evil?
He always has choices. He has the choice of going past Scylla or taking the route of the whirlpool, and he's been told that if he takes the whirlpool, it's most likely that the whole ship will be destroyed and sucked down into this terrible Charybdis. On the other hand, he knows that if he goes past Scylla, he will lose 6 men. So he decides not to tell his men about that, because he realizes that if they knew that 6 of them would die, they would stop rowing in that direction. And he tries to fight Scylla, but she cannot be fought. He has been told that too. And before he even sees her coming, Scylla has taken 6 of his men and is eating them up in the mouth of her cave. And he thinks this is the most horrible sight he's ever seen. But he gets through.
The reward for getting through is to become stranded on the island of Calypso, a goddess who causes Odysseus to fall under her spell. She keeps Odysseus in prison for 7 years before the god Zeus orders her to let him go. Between the Trojan War and the sea voyage, Odysseus has been away from home for 20 years.
The tales have a purpose. They are not repetitive. They show Odysseus facing a number of different challenges, and as he goes through these tales, in each one of them he is invited to forget the return home, to forget home, to stop living in a way, to die.
Finally, Odysseus reaches Ithaca. He comes home disguised as a beggar and finds that the young men of his kingdom have taken over his household. They want Penelope to give up on her husband and remarry.
The Queen.
Penelope proposes a contest to her suitors. She agrees to marry the man who can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through a dozen axes. The only man who can do it, of course, is Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar. After 20 years, he and Penelope are together again.
Odysseus' adventures, if we see them as tests, are much larger versions of the kinds of crises and problems and issues and adventures to which each of us is subject over the course of life. But what we all want, and what Odysseus above all has, is to be able to say, not only when he gets home, but when he's on his deathbed, man, I lived a life. And that's part of what makes him both such a rich source of entertainment and a kind of inspiration.
Yes, the Odyssey is a myth, but myth is not simply fiction. To the ancient Greeks, the gods who lived on Mount Olympus represented 2 things: the forces of nature like water, wind, and air, and the nature of man, desire, ambition, anger, and jealousy. Mythology taught the Greeks about the exploits of their heroes and the wisdom of their culture. It gave them an identity, a sense of national unity. And for the rest of us, Odysseus is the model for a kind of hero that still entertains and inspires us today.
Try this activity to complement mythology, Homer's Odyssey. Research Greek mythology and write your own adventure story about an achievement that you have accomplished. Use mythological characters to represent the forces that you struggled against for success.